He pushed a 60-year-old woman in a wheelchair against the glass wall, and the entire crowd did nothing, not a word, not a hand, just silence. Stay with me for one more minute and I'll reveal the truth behind that silence and why it shook an entire town. This is not just a story about cruelty in a shopping mall. It's about Clara, a woman who carried 60 years of strength, and the biker who refused to let injustice go unanswered. If you were standing there, would you have spoken up? Or would you have looked away? Share your feelings in the comments below because your voice matters. Thank you for listening, and may your day be filled with peace and meaning. It was late morning in the small southern town of Riverdale, a place where summer heat clung stubbornly to the brick sidewalks and the air seemed heavy with routine. From the last chapter's turmoil of judgment and silence, we turn now to a quieter corner of life, one that breathed with slower rhythms yet carried its own invisible weight. The people here lived simple lives, circling between the farmer's market, the church on Main Street, and the aging shopping mall that served as a hub for groceries, errands, and gossip. It was into this familiar pattern that Clara Johnson moved each day, not as a figure of importance, but as a shadow most chose not to see. Clara was 60 years old, her dark skin lined gently at the corners of her eyes, a testament not just to age but to the resilience etched by years of hardship. She had not walked since the accident that changed everything decades ago. One rainy evening, a driver ran a red light, steel and glass crushing into her mother's car, and though she survived, her spine did not. Since then, the wheelchair had become an inseparable companion, its scuffed metal frame and worn leather seat as much a part of her silhouette as her tightly curled hair and the faded scarf she often draped across her shoulders. She lived in a modest apartment above a laundromat, the kind of place where the walls were thin and the air always smelled faintly of detergent. Her income came from small crafts she made by hand-woven bracelets, painted trinket boxes, and sketches she sometimes sold at the Saturday market. She carried a worn sketchbook everywhere she went, its cover softened by years of use. Her tightly curled short black hair framed her face, and her thin frame sat upright in the wheelchair with hands that were bony yet steady. Her face was narrow with high cheekbones, lined with age, her deep-set eyes holding both weariness and quiet resolve. She often wore a gray scarf over a simple navy sweater, dark trousers, and brown flat shoes. It was not fashion that defined her, but quiet dignity in the way she carried herself. Yet Riverdale, for all its sunshine and rhythm, was not always kind. People recognized her, everyone did, but recognition rarely bloomed into connection. At the market, shoppers nodded curtly, then moved on as if a longer glance might entangle them in something uncomfortable. At the mall, clerks spoke quickly, their eyes darting from her chair to the line forming behind. Even neighbors greeted her politely, but never lingered long enough for conversation. To most, Clara was not Clara. She was simply the woman in the wheelchair, a label heavy enough to erase the rest of her story. There were days when she tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that the small kindnesses scattered through life, an extra napkin from the diner, a smile from a child were enough to keep her afloat. But the truth was harder. Every look of pity pressed like dust on glass, settling invisibly until it dulled her spirit. Every hurried avoidance reminded her that society had already drawn conclusions about her life before she ever spoke a word. The isolation was not physical, but it was relentless, a silence that followed her even in crowded spaces. On this particular morning, Clara rolled her chair slowly down Main Street toward the mall. The sun bounced off shop windows, and the smell of coffee drifted from a cafe where young people laughed loudly, oblivious to her passing. She noticed the quick flick of eyes as she went by, never a full stare, never engagement, but always enough to remind her she was different. Some expressions carried pity, others discomfort, but the result was the same. She felt reduced, shrunk into an object rather than a participant in life. Inside the mall, the air conditioning swept over her, cool but impersonal. The tiled floor echoed the sound of her wheels, a faint squeak at each rotation. She guided herself toward the craft store where she often bought supplies, moving deliberately, weaving between shoppers who shifted aside without meeting her gaze. She felt like an obstacle rather than a neighbor. The chatter around her rose and fell, but none of it included her. She paused at a bench near the fountain, opening her sketchbook to capture the moment. An elderly man feeding coins into the fountain with a trembling hand, a teenage girl balancing shopping bags, her face lit by her phone screen. Clara's pencil moved quickly, lines flowing with a grace that contrasted with her physical limitations. For a few minutes, the act of drawing created a bubble of peace. Within those pages, she was not invisible. She was an observer, an artist, and a creator of beauty others overlooked. But even here, small reminders intruded. A pair of women in business suits walked past, lowering their voices as they glanced her way. One of them smiled politely, but with the kind of smile that ended before reaching the eyes. Clara returned the gesture, though her chest tightened. She was used to this cycle, the nod of acknowledgement, the subtle withdrawal, the unspoken reminder that she belonged more to the margins than to the center. The truth settled heavily on her as she closed her sketchbook and placed it on her lap. Life in Riverdale was steady, predictable, yet for her, predictability carried its own kind of loneliness. She was present but unseen, known but never truly known. As she wheeled herself back into the moving stream of shoppers, she felt the weight of years pressing down, the sense that her dignity had been chipped away not by cruelty alone, but by the countless quiet dismissals that gathered like dust over time. In that moment, Clara told herself once again the words she often repeated silently: keep moving, keep drawing, don't disappear. It was not a battle cry, not a rebellion, but a gentle mantra of survival. For Clara Johnson, survival itself had become an act of quiet defiance, a way of holding on to her humanity in a world too quick to forget it. The morning unfolded slowly inside Riverdale Mall, the kind of weekend day when families strolled with shopping bags and teenagers clustered near the food court, while older folks found benches where they could sit and watch the flow of life pass by. After sketching for a while near the fountain, Clara rolled forward with her bag on her lap, making her way to the central elevators that rose through the 3 floors of the building. The air was cool, the background filled with chatter, clinking trays, and the faint music piped in through the speakers, yet none of it reached her as comfort. Her mind carried the echo of yesterday's loneliness, and though she kept her chin steady, she braced herself for the small frictions that always seemed to arrive when she tried to move through public spaces. The elevator lobby was busy. A digital display above the doors ticked upward, numbers changing one by one as the lift carried another group to higher floors. Clara maneuvered her wheelchair into place at the front of the line, her hands firm on the rims. Behind her, a cluster of shoppers formed, a mother juggling a toddler in a diaper bag, an elderly man in suspenders leaning on a cane, and further back, 3 young men who looked to be just on the edge of adulthood. Their presence filled the air differently from the rest, looser, louder, carrying a restless energy that crackled with impatience. The 3 of them stood shoulder to shoulder, each between 18 and 20 years old. The tallest wore a backwards baseball cap and a sleeveless hoodie that showed off lean arms marked with faint tattoos that looked more like doodles than art. His hair was shaggy, his jaw still soft with youth, but his expression carried the arrogance of someone who believed the world owed him shortcuts. The second had blonde spikes stiff with gel, a plaid shirt hanging open over a graphic tee, and a grin that rarely left his face, though it was less charm than mockery. The third was broader in build, a thick-necked boy in a black sports jersey, chewing gum as if it were an act of defiance. They shifted on their feet, exchanged smirks, and cast their attention forward, where Clara waited quietly at the front of the line. At first it was whispers, low enough to pass for casual conversation. A squeak escaped Clara's wheelchair as she adjusted her position, and the one with the baseball cap mimicked it, dragging his sneakers slowly across the tiled floor. His friend in the plaid shirt snickered, leaning closer to add, "Careful, man." "Keep that up and the whole place might collapse," their laughter carried, not loud but pointed, designed for her ears, even if they pretended otherwise. Clara kept her eyes on the panel above the elevator, watching the numbers descend, as if focus might build a shield around her. But the boys pressed harder, emboldened by the lack of reaction. The blond one pitched his voice just a little higher, mocking with a smirk. "If those wheels squeal any louder, the elevator might give up." Imagine being trapped because Grandma here needed a ride. The gum chewer slapped his friend on the arm, laughing, then added with false sympathy, "Normal people take the escalator. Guess some folks just like holding up the line." Their words fell sharp and ugly, cutting through the soft murmur of the crowd. The mother with the toddler looked down quickly, bouncing her child against her hip as if distraction could erase what she'd heard. The elderly man tapped his cane nervously and shifted his gaze to the floor. No one said a word. Clara's jaw tightened. She had been here before, too many times reduced to a symbol, made into the punchline of someone else's boredom. But something in her stiffened, the quiet dignity that refused to vanish completely. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes steady though her hands trembled slightly on the rims of her chair. Her voice was calm, low, but firm. You should learn to respect your elders. Didn't anyone ever teach you that? For a moment, silence bloomed, the unexpected rebuke hanging in the air. The tallest one blinked, then barked a laugh, sharp and derisive. Hear that? Granny thinks she can lecture us. The blonde leaned in closer, lips curling cruelly. Respect? Maybe earn it first. His words dripped with scorn. The one in the jersey stepped forward, closing the gap, his shadow falling over Clara's chair. What happened next came swift and jarring. With a huff of irritation, the broad-shouldered boy pressed his hand roughly against the back of her wheelchair and shoved. The chair jolted forward, its wheels skidding against the tiles, and Clara's shoulder struck the cold glass wall beside the elevator doors. A gasp left her lips as pain flared through her arm. Her sketchbook, balanced on her lap, slipped to the floor, pages splaying open across the polished tiles. The laughter of the three boys rang out, harsh and triumphant, echoing cruelly in the hushed space. The crowd reacted, but only inwardly. The mother adjusted her grip on her child and pretended to dig through her bag. The elderly man turned away, pretending to study the mall directory. A pair of teenagers scrolling their phones nearby raised their eyes briefly, then lowered them again, retreating into screens as if safety lay in detachment. Phones hovered in hands, but no one lifted them to record. No one raised their voice to intervene. It was the same old rhythm, silence, avoidance, complicity. Clara clenched her teeth, forcing back the sting of tears. She pressed her palms against the arms of her chair, steadying herself, pulling upright despite the throb in her shoulder. She bent to gather her sketchbook, fingers brushing across pages that had scattered sketches of strangers' faces. Faces she had captured with tenderness, people who now stood around her unwilling to meet her gaze. As she lifted the book back onto her lap, her heart sank heavy, the weight of humiliation pressing against her chest more than the bruise blooming on her skin. The elevator dinged then, a cheerful chime mocking the tension in the air. The doors slid open, revealing a handful of passengers exiting, their eyes widening at the sight of the scene but quickly averting as they brushed past. Clara stayed where she was, her chair angled awkwardly from the shove, her spirit bruised by more than the physical blow. She breathed deeply, slow and quiet, trying to gather what little composure she could in a space that had turned hostile with just a few words and a single shove. And still, the silence remained. The bystanders shuffled, murmured faintly, but offered no words of comfort, no gestures of support. The three young men, grinning with the arrogance of impunity, leaned back on their heels, satisfied with the discomfort they had caused. Clara sat alone in the midst of the crowd, her dignity trembling but unbroken, the sting of isolation heavier than ever before. The mall corridor had fallen into an uneasy quiet after Clara was shoved against the glass, the elevator doors still gaping open as though mocking her humiliation. People shifted in place, pretending to be absorbed in their phones or the straps of their shopping bags, but no one stepped forward. The three young men stood grinning, their laughter bouncing harshly in the sterile light, while Clara steadied herself in her chair, sketchbook clutched tightly to her lap. Unbeknownst to the crowd, in the seating area a short distance away, someone had seen everything. Malcolm Hayes was a man in his early 50s. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the heavy frame of someone who had lived years on the road. His beard was thick, streaked with gray, and scars crisscrossed his knuckles like maps of old battles. A weathered leather jacket hung from his shoulders, its back stitched with the faded insignia of the Iron Serpents, a biker gang once infamous in the region. Malcolm's dark eyes had been fixed on Clara from the moment the boys began their mockery. He had seen the chair jolt forward, seen her shoulder collide with glass, and he had watched the crowd shrink back into cowardice. He pushed himself from the bench with deliberate slowness, the heavy thud of his boots echoing on the polished floor as he approached the elevator line. Conversations faltered as heads turned, murmurs rising, the sight of the jacket pulling whispers from those who remembered its history. Clara felt the shift before she saw him, the sound of footsteps drawing near. She turned her head slightly and found herself looking up into a face she did not recognize. Rugged, stern, but not unkind. Malcolm crouched slightly, his large hand steadying the wheel of her chair, adjusting its angle away from the wall with a careful precision. His voice came low, not booming, but weighted with calm authority. "She goes first." The words were not shouted, but they cut through the air like steel. The crowd, previously silent, now leaned in to hear. The three young men blinked, their smirks faltering only for a moment before dissolving into fresh bursts of laughter. The one in the sleeveless hoodie tilted his chin, eyes gleaming with arrogant amusement. "You think you're somebody, old man? A biker jacket and a beard don't make you king here." The blonde one with spiked hair leaned forward, his grin sharpened into cruelty. "What's next? You gonna tell us bedtime stories about the good old days? She's just slowing everyone down." He jabbed a finger toward Clara, his gesture dismissive, as though her presence were nothing but an inconvenience. The third, chewing gum with exaggerated care, spat the wad onto the floor near Malcolm's boot, a gesture of disdain meant to provoke. But Malcolm did not react with fury. He stood taller, his frame casting a long shadow over the three boys. His face remained calm, his eyes steady, his voice measured. He said nothing further, letting the weight of his silence speak louder than bluster. For a moment, the arrogance of the young men wavered under that gaze, yet pride would not let them retreat. The tallest one reached out a hand, bold in his ignorance, and moved to shove Clara's chair once more. It happened in an instant. Malcolm's arm rose, not in anger but in precision, his hand catching the boy's wrist mid-motion. With a simple twist of pressure and a firm push, he shifted the young man back a step, not enough to injure, but enough to make the movement impossible to mistake. The boy stumbled slightly, more from shock than force, his mouth falling open as if the brief contact had burned. The other two stiffened, their bravado suddenly fragile. Clara felt her breath catch, the sudden barrier of protection like a shield she had never expected to find. For a fleeting second, she felt less alone, as though someone had finally acknowledged her worth by standing between her and cruelty. Around them, however, the audience of bystanders only grew more anxious, their silence thick with uncertainty. And then came the outcry. "He hit me!" the tallest one shouted, clutching his arm dramatically though no harm had been done. "This psycho just attacked us," his friends chimed in instantly, their voices rising in unison, loud enough to draw attention from every corner of the lobby. "He shoved us." "He's dangerous. Someone call the cops." Their words tumbled out, a tangle of lies designed to cover the humiliation of being checked, their faces twisted into masks of false victimhood. The shouting from the three young men filled the lobby like a siren of its own, their cries of victimhood rising above the hushed crowd, and it was that noise which drew attention faster than anything else. A pair of police officers had been patrolling just outside the main entrance, two men accustomed to weekend duty in Riverdale Mall, and with them came a mall security guard in a navy uniform who had been monitoring the corridor. The trio responded instantly to the uproar, boots striking against the tile as they hurried toward the elevator line, their eyes scanning the cluster of people already frozen in tense silence. The first officer was young, maybe 26, his face clean-shaven, his brown hair clipped short beneath his cap, and his uniform pressed to perfection as though he wanted to prove himself with discipline. He moved with brisk energy, his hand resting on the strap of his utility belt, eyes flashing with suspicion the moment he saw Malcolm's leather jacket and the looming outline of his frame. The second was older, well into his 50s, his hair thinning at the crown, his posture steady but not hurried. He had the watchful gaze of someone who had spent decades reading lies and truths in equal measure, his pace slower as though he wanted to take in the whole scene before choosing a side. The security guard, a broad man in his 40s with a slight limp, pointed toward the disturbance as they arrived, his voice raised above the babble. "It's those three boys and the bike or something went down by the elevator." The younger officer's eyes darted immediately to Malcolm, who stood tall, arms at his sides, his expression unreadable. Clara sat just behind him, her hands clenched on her sketchbook, while the three youths were already clutching at their arms and pointing wildly. "He attacked us!" "He!" the tallest shouted, his face flushed with manufactured outrage. "He shoved us, threatened us, scared everyone here." The blonde echoed quickly, his words tumbling fast as though speed would make them more convincing. "He just lost it, went crazy. You saw what he was wearing. He's dangerous." The third added with a sneer, "This whole place is on edge because of him." Their accusations overlapped, frantic and practiced, their eyes darting between the officers and the bystanders as if daring someone to contradict them. The younger policeman stepped forward, his hand already brushing the cuffs at his hip, his body tensing as though to restrain Malcolm before questions were asked. "Sir, I'm going to need you to—" he began, but Malcolm's voice cut across his words, low and steady, calm without a hint of panic. "I did not attack anyone. I stopped them from pushing her again. That is all. If you want the truth, check your cameras. The footage will tell the story better than I can." His tone carried the weight of certainty, and though he did not raise his voice, it was clear enough for the entire crowd to hear. Clara felt her throat tighten. For a moment she feared he might be ignored, that the uniform would outweigh his truth, but something in his stillness made even the young officer hesitate. The older policeman raised a hand, signaling his partner to pause, his eyes narrowing as he swept his gaze from the bruised dignity on Clara's face to the smirks just barely hidden on the boy's lips. "Manager," he called out firmly, "get us the feed from the elevator cameras." Now, his voice carried authority sharpened by years of command, and the mall's floor manager, a short man in a vest and tie who had been lingering nervously near the corner, rushed off toward the control room without a word. The crowd seemed to breathe again, whispers spreading as if the spell of silence had been broken by the older officer's intervention. Parents held their children closer. Teenagers raised phones to record now that it seemed safer, and even the elderly man with the cane edged nearer, curiosity tugging him forward. Malcolm did not move, his stance as unmoving as a statue, while Clara shifted uneasily in her chair, pain lingering in her shoulder but eclipsed by the fear that truth might yet be swallowed by lies. When the manager returned, a laptop under his arm and a flash drive clenched tightly in his hand, he plugged into the small monitor at the security desk by the wall. The screen flickered to life, grainy but clear enough to show the line at the elevator, Clara at the front, the boys behind, their mocking gestures, the shove that sent her chair against the glass, and Malcolm's calm intervention that followed. Gasps broke out from those who had dared doubt, and even the younger officer's rigid posture softened as he watched the unmistakable sequence unfold before him. The older policeman turned sharply, his voice resonant with the finality of judgment. "Public harassment with clear bias. You three are banned from this mall for 6 months, and you'll serve 50 hours of community labor." His gaze pinned them in place, his eyes hard as stone. The smirks evaporated from their faces, replaced by the dull color of humiliation. The tallest looked down at his shoes, the blonde chewed his lip furiously, and the third shifted awkwardly, his bravado gone. The security guard stepped forward to guide them aside, his large frame herding the boys toward the far wall as the officers filled out notes. Around them, the crowd exhaled collectively, relief passing through the onlookers as though the weight of complicity had lifted slightly. Clara sat quietly, her heart hammering, her eyes wet, not from pain, but from the unthinkable sight. Justice, delivered swiftly and publicly. She clutched her sketchbook closer, her hand trembling, as she realized that for the first time in years, the scales had tipped in her favor. The younger officer, his voice quieter now, looked toward Clara with a flicker of regret. He did not apologize, but his hesitation carried its own admission. The older officer turned back to the room, his words crisp and final. "This matter is settled. Let it be a reminder that silence does not excuse cruelty. We will not tolerate it here." The murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd, and though most avoided Clara's eyes, the shame on their faces told its own story. Clara remained seated near the elevator, the sting in her shoulder still present, but her spirit steadied by the simple fact that someone at last had stood for her. As the boys were led away, their swagger stripped bare, she let out a slow breath. For once, she was not invisible. For once, the truth had been seen by all. The events at Riverdale Mall did not stay contained within its glass walls. By the next morning, videos spread across social media, replayed on phones, posted on community forums, and whispered about over coffee. The image of a biker stepping in front of a woman in a wheelchair and 3 mocking youths spoke louder than any headline. Strangers online called him the kind-hearted biker, but Malcolm Hayes himself never embraced the name. When asked by a reporter outside a diner, his voice was steady. "I didn't do anything special. I did what anyone should do: respect and protect another human being." In the days that followed, curiosity grew. People who once avoided Malcolm now looked at him differently, though he seemed unchanged. He continued his quiet routines, his motorcycle parked at the edge of town, groceries carried with steady hands, eyes always set forward. Yet wherever he went, whispers followed, admiration mixed with shame. For the town remembered that while they had stayed silent, he alone had acted. A week later, Riverdale's town hall was overflowing. The red brick building glowed in the afternoon light as streams of people filed inside, filling every seat in the wide room. The air was thick with anticipation. Men in work boots, women in neat dresses, students in hoodies, all had come, waiting for someone to speak what weighed on their minds. The murmur of voices rose and fell like a tide, restless and uneasy. Clara arrived early, guiding her wheelchair to a place in the back row. She wore a navy sweater with a gray scarf laid neatly across her shoulders, dark trousers falling straight over her knees, and brown flats just visible at the footrests. Her sketchbook rested on her lap, closed but present, as if reminding her she was more than what people chose to see. At the podium, the mayor in a gray suit began with words about values, courage, and unity. His practiced tone carried through the hall, but felt thin, like a curtain drawn over something heavier. The crowd listened politely, but their eyes slid past him. Finally, with a nod, he stepped back. "Tonight, we hear from a man who acted when many of us did not. Please welcome Malcolm Hayes." Malcolm rose from his chair at the side aisle. His leather jacket caught the light, its insignia faded but unmistakable, a reminder of a past life that still followed him. His boots struck the wooden floor in steady rhythm as he reached the podium. He stood tall, his beard framing his face, his eyes scanning the audience without flinching. When he spoke, his voice filled the hall, clear and resonant. "That day," he said, "there were dozens of people at the elevators, dozens of witnesses, and yet not one of you spoke. Not one of you said enough." The words landed heavy, rippling across the crowd. Some shifted in their seats, others lowered their eyes, but silence held. Malcolm leaned closer to the microphone, his tone firmer now. "We allowed a 60-year-old woman in a wheelchair to be mocked, shoved, and humiliated before our eyes. She did not need pity. She did not need charity. What she needed, and still needs, is respect." His hand lifted, pointing to the back rows. "She is here tonight. Clara Johnson. She has lived in this town her whole life. She has worked, endured, and carried herself with dignity even in silence. She is not invisible, but you treated her as if she were." The entire hall turned. Dozens of eyes found Clara, who sat still, her hands resting on her sketchbook. She bowed her head gently, not to hide but to acknowledge the moment. In her eyes flickered something new. Quiet pride, rising after years of being overlooked. The silence in the hall was no longer neglect but reckoning. Malcolm let it linger, then closed with words steady and unyielding. "Respect is not a gift. It is not charity. It is the recognition of another person's humanity. Remember that the next time cruelty hides behind laughter. Remember it, because silence is not innocence." His gaze swept across the room, holding each listener accountable before he stepped back. The applause came slowly, hesitant at first, then grew stronger, not like cheers for a performance, but as acknowledgement of a truth too long ignored. When the meeting ended, Clara wheeled herself through the tall doors into the warm evening light. The sun cast golden reflections across her sketchbook. As she moved down the steps, Malcolm passed by and gave her a single nod. She met his eyes and returned the gesture. No words were spoken. Respect at last had found its way to her. In the end, this story is not only about Clara or Malcolm. It is about every person who has carried the weight of prejudice yet still chosen dignity, about every soul who helps others without seeking reward, and about the simple truth that justice must be lived, not just spoken. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you care about. Leave a comment with your thoughts and reflections, because your voice matters. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that honor courage and compassion. And may God bless you and guide you with strength, resilience, and kindness in every step of your life.